In December 2022, Spain's Football Federation needed a new head coach. Their previous manager had just been eliminated from the World Cup on penalties by Morocco in the round of 16. A humiliating exit for a country that considers itself one of football's great powers. They didn't hire a star name. They didn't chase a manager with Champions League trophies or a famous playing career. They promoted a 61-year-old Federation employee who had spent the better part of a decade quietly running Spain's youth teams, someone most casual fans outside Spain had never heard of. 3.5 years later, that same coach, Luis de la Fuente, stood in a stadium in New Jersey as his team lifted the World Cup, Spain's second title in its history, his fourth major trophy in less than 3 years. At the time of his appointment, that outcome would have sounded absurd to almost anyone in Spanish football. This wasn't a man with a famous playing career or a resume full of Champions League nights. He was, by his own federation's own internal reputation, the safe, unglamorous option. The guy already inside the building who wouldn't need an introduction. Here's what almost nobody outside Spain understood about that hire in 2022. It wasn't a safe, boring choice at all. It was the final step of a 25-year plan that De La Fuente had been quietly executing since before most of his current players were born. Compare that to how most national federations actually behave after a painful tournament exit. The instinct, almost everywhere in international football, is to chase the biggest available name. A manager with Champions League pedigree, someone whose hiring alone generates headlines and buys a federation a news cycle of goodwill. Spain did the opposite. They looked inward, past the obvious candidates, and handed the job to a man whose entire resume was built on work nobody outside the federation had ever been asked to pay attention to. That decision alone tells you something about what Spain's federation actually valued at that moment. Not a splashy appointment designed to reassure an anxious fan base overnight, but a bet on institutional memory, on someone who already knew, in granular detail, exactly which players in the pipeline were ready for senior football and which weren't. Luis de la Fuente Castillo was born in 1961 in Haro, a small wine country town in La Rioja that has never produced a footballing dynasty of any kind. He came up through Athletic Club's youth system as a left back, made his senior debut in the early 1980s, and spent 14 years as a professional, mostly at Athletic, with a stretch at Sevilla in between, finishing his playing career at Deportivo Alavés in 1994. 2 league titles, 1 domestic cup. A respectable career, not a legendary one. Most retired players who stay in football take one of 2 paths. They either use their name to jump straight into a club's first team, or they leave the sport for punditry, where a recognizable face matters more than actual coaching ability. De La Fuente did neither. In 1997, he started at Portugalete, a club in the regional lower divisions of Basque football, coaching at a level so far from the spotlight that almost no one tracking his career today could tell you a single result from it. There was no shortcut available to him that he refused to take either. Athletic Club is one of the most storied names in Spanish football, and De La Fuente had played for them twice. He could have leaned on that name to skip straight to a more visible bench. Instead, he chose the version of the coaching ladder that takes the longest to climb and offers the least public credit along the way, on the theory, apparently, that understanding how to build a team from nothing mattered more than getting there quickly. Therefore, by the time De La Fuente took over Sevilla's youth setup in 2001, he had already spent 4 years proving, to almost nobody watching, that he was willing to build a coaching career from the absolute bottom. At Sevilla, over 4 seasons, he coached a generation of academy players that included a teenage Sergio Ramos and a teenage Jesús Navas. 2 players who would go on to become Champions League winners, World Cup winners, and cornerstones of the Spanish national team for over a decade. De La Fuente got none of the credit for that generation's rise. He was already gone, back at Athletic, coaching youth teams again, by the time either of them broke into the professional game. This is where most coaching careers either accelerate or quietly die. De La Fuente's did neither. It just kept grinding. Back at Athletic, he took charge of the Juvenil de Honor side, then Bilbao Athletic, the club's reserve team, across 2 separate stints between 2006 and 2011. Reserve team football is a strange purgatory in Spanish football. High enough level to matter, low enough profile that almost nobody outside the club pays attention to who's actually in charge. Not everyone reads this kind of career the same way. Some fans and analysts argue that a coach who spent 25 years exclusively in youth and lower division football simply got lucky, handed a golden generation he happened to be standing next to when it matured, rather than one he actually built. Others argue the opposite, that the golden generation only turned golden because of the discipline De La Fuente had already been instilling in half of those players since they were teenagers in his youth setups. Both sides have real evidence. Neither has fully convinced the other. In 2011, he took his first real gamble on senior first-team management, a brief stint at Deportivo Alaves. It didn't lead anywhere. No trophy, no breakout run, no headline moment that turned him into a wanted man. For a 50-year-old coach with a modest playing career and a resume built entirely on academy football, that kind of stall could easily have been the end of the story. Plenty of coaches with far more promising starts than his have disappeared from the sport entirely after a setback like that. For 2 years after that Alaves stint, De La Fuente had no senior coaching job at all. Just a resume that, on paper, looked like a mid-tier career quietly winding down. Some regional football, some reserve teams, one unremarkable top-flight stint. Nothing left to prove and no obvious next step waiting for him. Instead, in 2013, De La Fuente went back to what had actually been working the whole time, developing kids nobody else wanted to develop yet. He took over Spain's youth national teams, and it's here that the quiet, unglamorous strategy finally started producing results other people could see. His under-19 side won the European Championship in 2015. His under-21 side won it again in 2019. He took Spain's Olympic team to a silver medal at the Tokyo Games, working with waves of teenagers who, within a few years, would form the spine of his senior World Cup squad. By 2022, Luis de la Fuente had spent 25 years coaching almost exclusively in the shadows. Regional football, reserve teams, youth national teams, without ever once holding a marquee senior job. When Spain's federation needed someone to clean up after a painful World Cup exit, they didn't have to guess whether he could handle pressure. They had 2.5 decades of receipts. The results came almost immediately, and they kept coming. In his first year in charge, De La Fuente won the 2022-23 UEFA Nations League, Spain's first ever, beating Croatia on penalties after a scoreless draw. At Euro 2024 in Germany, his team won every single match, 7 wins in 7 games, the first team in the tournament's history to do it without needing a single penalty shootout, beating England 2-1 in the final. Therefore, by the time the 2026 World Cup arrived, De La Fuente wasn't an unproven federation appointment anymore. He was a coach with 2 major trophies already, about to make the most controversial decision of his career, naming a World Cup squad with 0 Real Madrid players on it, and back it up by winning the whole tournament, beating the man who had once sat in his own coaching classroom, earning a license under him, Argentina's Lionel Scaloni. 25 years is a long time to wait for recognition. De La Fuente spent almost all of it coaching players whose names the wider football world wouldn't learn until years later. Sergio Ramos and Jesús Navas as teenagers at Sevilla, a generation of Spanish youth internationals who grew up to form his World Cup winning spine. He never rushed the timeline. He never took a shortcut through a bigger club's first team just to raise his profile. He built, slowly, in places nobody was watching, until the day arrived when everybody had no choice but to watch. There's a version of this profession where patience like that gets punished, where a coach who refuses to chase visibility simply gets passed over forever, forgotten by the federations and clubs that only remember the names already trending. De La Fuente's entire career is the counterargument to that fear. Every unglamorous stop, every regional division season, every youth tournament nobody outside Spain was tracking, turned out to be data he was quietly collecting on how to build a team that could survive real pressure. He just never got to prove it on the biggest stage until he was 65 years old. It also explains something coaches rarely get credit for: the calm. Watching De La Fuente on the touchline during Spain's shakiest moments this tournament, a scoreless draw against Cabo Verde, a press turning on his best midfielder, a stadium full of his own fans losing interest mid-match. He never looked like a man discovering pressure for the first time. He looked like someone who had already spent 25 years learning exactly what panic costs a team, and had simply decided, a long time ago, not to pay it. Not every player on that World Cup winning roster had it easy on the way up either. One of them tore the ligament in his knee less than 2 years before the tournament and watched his own club collapse without him. Then came back to be voted the best player at the entire World Cup. That's the next video on this channel. Subscribe so you don't miss it.